Hola, welcome back to another Spanish lesson with Senor Guys. In this video, we're going to be talking about YOJO verbs. These are verbs that when you conjugate them in the present tense in the yo form, they are going to change a G to a J so that the word ends up ending in a JO. So this only applies to verbs that end in GER and verbs that end in GIR. So some of the verbs that I'm going to be talking about today are proteger, which means to protect. Notice that proteger ends in GER, and escoger, which means to choose. Escoger also ends in GER. Verbs that end in GIR are verbs like dirigir, which means to direct, and elegir, which means to elect or pick. Notice also that elegir is a stem-changing verb that changes from E to I. So when we conjugate these verbs in the yo form, the GER at the end, normally you would change the ER to an O and have GO. But with GER verbs and YOJO verbs, we're going to change that G to a J so that the word ends in a JO instead of a GO. And the same thing with verbs that end in GIR. When we conjugate it and add the O at the end, we also need to change that G to a J. If you're interested as to why we do this, it's because of the way we pronounce G in Spanish, the letter G. There's two different ways you can actually pronounce the letter G. There is the hard G sound, so G as in go, and then soft H sound that almost sounds like an H. Remember in Spanish that a J sound, or a J, makes a H, or a kind of a soft H sound. And the way you tell which way to pronounce the G is based on which vowel comes after the letter G. So if you remember, the vowels are A, E, I, O, and U. And it depends on which vowel you're using if you're going to pronounce the G hard, like G, or if you pronounce the G soft, like H. So if the G is before the letter A, it's hard. So G-A sounds like ga. But after an E, a G sounds soft, like H. So G-E sounds like he. And the same thing with G-I. When the G is in front of the letter I, it sounds soft, like H or he. And in front of O and U, G is going to be a hard G sound. So G-O sounds like go, and G-U sounds like goo. So this is why we change the G to a J, so that we can retain that soft H sound with verbs that end in GER and GIR. So when we change GER to GO, GER is pronounced ger, as in proteger, but when we add an O on the end, it changes that G sound to a hard G sound from a soft that it was originally. So we need to keep that soft H sound, which is why we change the G to a J, so that it stays the same pronunciation. So ger and ho instead of ger and go. And with GIR, since GI sounds like gir, when we conjugate and put the O at the end, it changes the G to sound hard, like go. But we want to keep that soft H sound in gir. So we change the G to a J to keep the H sound. So now gir changes to ho. This is more of a spelling change than a really change in how you say anything. So just to go over some examples, proteger means to protect. And when you conjugate it in all of the forms except for the yo form, you can conjugate it normally with an E. Proteger is an ER verb, so you can say proteges, protege, protegemos, protegéis, and protegen. But when you conjugate it in the yo form, proteger ends in GER. So when you conjugate it in the yo form, you change the ER to O, but now we need to make sure that it sounds like an H. So we don't want to say protego, we want to say protejo, which is why we change the G to a J. So when we conjugate it in the yo form, we're going to spell it with a J instead of a G. So protejo, proteges, etc. Escoger means to choose. and it's the same thing. You can conjugate it regularly in all of the other forms except for the yo form. But when you conjugate in the yo form, since it ends in GER, escoger, when we conjugate it in the yo form, we're going to add the O, and we need it to sound like jo. So escoger changed to escojo. But if you just add the O, the G-O makes a go sound, so we would pronounce this go, but we want to pronounce it jo. So we change the G to a J. Escojo is the yo form of escoger with a J. Dirigir means to direct, and you can conjugate it regularly in all the forms except for the yo form. So when you conjugate it in the yo form, since it ends in GIR or GIR, you're going to change the IR to an O like regular, and then you're also going to change the G to a J so that you keep that soft H sound. So we can say dirijo, diriges, dirige, dirigimos, dirigís, dirigen. Finally, elegir means to elect, and you can conjugate it regularly in all the forms except for the yo form. Also notice that elegir is a stem-changing verb, so in the tu, el, and ellos form, that E is changing to an I, so eliges, elige, eligen have I's in them, but elegimos and elegís keep the E after the L. In the yo form, you can't just leave the G in there, since it ends in GIR, elegir. When we conjugate it in the yo form, we're going to make that stem change, so elijo is what we want to say, but how do you spell elijo? You need to change the G to a J, so elijo is spelled with a J, and you can conjugate it like that.